What would you do if your entire town gathered to bury you while you watched from your bedroom window? What if they carved your name into stone, delivered eulogies about your life, and threw dirt on an empty coffin, all while you were very much alive, breathing, and completely horrified by what you were witnessing? This isn't the plot of a horror movie. This actually happened in the small town of Millbrook, Vermont, in 1947, and the story I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about death, community, and the terrifying power of collective madness. My name is on the research team that uncovered this buried piece of American history, hidden in dusty town records and faded newspaper clippings that were deliberately kept from the public eye for over 70 years. What we found was so disturbing that we debated whether to share it at all. But some stories demand to be told. The man at the center of this nightmare was Harold Wickham, a 42-year-old telegraph operator who lived alone in a modest house on Elm Street. Harold wasn't particularly liked or disliked. He was simply invisible, the kind of person you'd pass on the street without a second thought. He kept to himself, paid his taxes, and bothered no one. That invisibility would become his curse. It started with a mistake so simple it's almost laughable. On March 15, 1947, Harold caught pneumonia. In those days, before modern antibiotics, pneumonia was often a death sentence. Harold's condition worsened rapidly, and by March 20th, he was delirious with fever, confined to his bed. Dr. Edmund Carver, the town's only physician, made house calls twice daily. But on March 22nd, something went terribly wrong. Dr. Carver arrived at Harold's house during a particularly severe fever spike. Harold was unconscious, barely breathing, with a pulse so weak it was almost undetectable. Dr. Carver checked for vital signs. Nothing. He held a mirror to Harold's mouth. No fog appeared. He listened to Harold's chest with his stethoscope. Silence. Harold Wickham was dead, or so Dr. Carver believed. The doctor signed the death certificate on the spot. Within hours, the news had spread through Millbrook like wildfire. Harold Wickham, the quiet telegraph operator, had succumbed to pneumonia. The funeral was scheduled for March 20-5th. But here's where our story takes its first horrifying turn. Harold wasn't dead. He was in what medical science now recognizes as a cataleptic state, a condition where the body becomes rigid and unresponsive, with breathing and heart rates so reduced they become virtually undetectable. It's a rare condition, but it happens. And in 1947, the medical knowledge to distinguish between catalepsy and death simply didn't exist in small-town Vermont. Harold regained consciousness on March 24th, one day before his scheduled funeral. Imagine waking up to discover that your death certificate has been signed, your obituary published, and your funeral planned. Imagine the terror of realizing that tomorrow, your neighbors intend to bury you 6 feet underground. Harold's first instinct was relief. Surely, once he appeared in town, everyone would realize the mistake. Dr. Carver would be embarrassed. The funeral would be cancelled, and life would return to normal. He was wrong. When Harold walked into town that morning, the reaction wasn't relief or joy. It was horror. Mrs. Patterson, the baker's wife, saw him first. She screamed and fainted in the middle of Main Street. Word spread quickly. Harold Wickham's ghost was walking among them. But this wasn't just superstition. Something darker was at work. You see, Millbrook had a secret. The town was broke. The previous mayor had embezzled most of the municipal funds before fleeing to Canada. The remaining city council members had been covering up the financial disaster for months. Desperately seeking a way to restore the town's depleted coffers, Harold's supposed death presented an unexpected opportunity. According to town records we uncovered, Harold had no living relatives and no will. Under Vermont state law, his property would eventually revert to the municipality. His house, his savings, his few possessions, everything would belong to Millbrook, but only if Harold remained legally dead. The town council met in emergency session. That very night, the minutes from that meeting, hidden in a vault for 76 years, reveal the depths of their desperation and greed. They made a decision that would haunt Millbrook forever. Harold Wickham would stay dead, whether he liked It or not, Dr. Carver was brought into the conspiracy. His medical license was already under review for other questionable practices, and the council threatened to ruin him completely unless he cooperated. The death certificate would stand. Harold was legally dead, and legally dead he would remain. But what about Harold himself? What about the inconvenient fact that he was walking around, very much alive? The council had a plan for that too. On March 25th, Harold's funeral proceeded as scheduled. But Harold wasn't invited. In fact, when he tried to approach the church, he was physically turned away by men from the town. They claimed he was disturbing the peace, disrespecting the dead, causing public hysteria. Harold watched his own funeral from his bedroom window. He saw the entire town gathered in the cemetery behind the church. He heard the eulogies praising his quiet, reliable nature. He watched them lower an empty coffin into the ground and throw dirt on his grave. But the psychological torture was just beginning. The next morning, Harold went to the bank to withdraw money for food. His accounts were frozen. Harold Wickham was dead, and dead men don't need bank accounts. He went to the post office to collect his mail. There was no mail for Harold Wickham. Dead men don't receive correspondence. He tried to buy groceries. The store owner refused his money. Harold Wickham was dead, and the town wouldn't trade with a ghost. Within days, Harold was completely cut off from society. No one would speak to him directly. When he approached people on the street, they either ignored him completely or crossed themselves and hurried away. Children were forbidden from going near his house. Some parents told their kids that Harold was a dangerous spirit who would drag them to hell if they got too close. Harold tried to leave Millbrook, but discovered that his identification was no longer valid. His driver's license had been revoked. Posthumously, he had no social security number because Harold Wickham didn't exist. He was trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare where he was simultaneously present and absent, alive and dead. The isolation began to break him. Harold started talking to himself during his long, lonely days. Neighbors reported seeing him having animated conversations with invisible companions. He would stand in his yard and deliver speeches to empty air, pleading his case to an audience that wasn't there. He began leaving notes on doorsteps around town, handwritten messages begging for recognition, for acknowledgement that he existed. The notes were always thrown away, unread. Some people burned them, claiming they were cursed. The town's treatment of Harold grew more cruel as time passed. Teenagers would sneak up to his windows at night and tap on the glass, then run away laughing. People would leave funeral flowers on his doorstep as a macabre joke. Someone painted "RIP" on his front door. Harold's mental state deteriorated rapidly. The town records include disturbing reports from this period. Harold was seen dancing alone in his backyard at midnight, spinning in circles and laughing hysterically. He was observed having elaborate dinner parties for dozens of imaginary guests, setting the table with his mother's fine china and conducting animated conversations with empty chairs. The most unsettling incident occurred in late May. Harold appeared in the town square at noon, dressed in his finest suit. He stood on a wooden crate and delivered what witnesses described as his own eulogy, speaking about Harold Wickham in the third person, as if he truly was dead. He praised Harold's contributions to the community, mourned Harold's tragic early death, and expressed hope that Harold was at peace in the afterlife. The performance lasted nearly an hour. Not a single person in the crowd acknowledged his presence. That night, something inside Harold Wickham finally snapped. If the town wanted him to be dead, he would become their ghost. Harold began appearing everywhere at once, or so it seemed. He would stand silently outside people's windows at night, just watching. He would follow townspeople during their daily routines, always maintaining a distance of exactly 10 feet. Never speaking, never interacting, just there. He developed an uncanny ability to appear when least expected. People would turn corners and find Harold standing there, motionless, staring. They would look up from their morning coffee to see Harold's pale face pressed against their kitchen window. Children would wake up to see Harold's silhouette in their backyard, standing perfectly still under the moonlight. The psychological effect on the town was devastating. People stopped going out after dark. Parents kept their children inside. The once bustling Main Street became a ghost town after sunset. But Harold wasn't finished. In June, he began leaving gifts. Not ordinary gifts, disturbing personal items that proved he had been inside people's homes. A woman would find her grandmother's necklace, which she kept locked in a jewelry box sitting on her kitchen counter. A man would discover his private diary, which he hid under his mattress. Open on his dining room table, no one could explain how Harold was getting inside their homes. Doors were always locked. Windows were always secure. There were no signs of forced entry. Harold simply moved through the town like smoke, untouchable and omnipresent. The town council meetings became increasingly frantic. Some members wanted to reverse their decision, to acknowledge Harold as alive and end the nightmare, but it was too late. The legal complications would expose their financial crimes. They were trapped by their own conspiracy. Dr. Carver suffered a complete nervous breakdown in July. He was found in his office at 3 a.m, frantically writing the same sentence over and over. Harold Wickham is not dead. Harold Wickham is not dead. Harold Wickham is not dead. He filled 57 pages with this single sentence before being committed to the state mental hospital. The breaking point came in August. Harold began attending his own funeral. Every Sunday, he would appear in the cemetery, standing beside his own grave. He would remain there for exactly 1 hour, sometimes talking quietly to his headstone, sometimes just standing in complete silence. The groundskeeper, Tom Mueller, was the first to notice that Harold's grave was changing. Fresh flowers appeared daily, though no one admitted to bringing them. The grass around the plot grew unnaturally green and thick. Most disturbing of all, the headstone began to develop hairline cracks that formed patterns resembling a face, Harold's face. According to those brave enough to look closely, by September, the entire town was living in terror. Businesses were failing as people refused to leave their homes. Families were moving away without explanation. Property values plummeted. The situation reached its climax on September 23rd, exactly 6 months after Harold's supposed death that night. Every person in Millbrook had the same dream. They dreamed of Harold's funeral, but this time, Harold was in the coffin. They watched as dirt was thrown onto his face, as darkness closed over him, as he suffocated in the cold ground. But in the dream, Harold's eyes remained open throughout the burial. He was aware, conscious, feeling every shovelful of earth, experiencing every moment of being buried alive. The entire town woke up screaming. The next morning, an emergency town meeting was called. For the first time in 6 months, the conspiracy was discussed openly. People confessed to seeing Harold. They described the terror of living with a ghost who was more real than the living. Mayor Robert Spoo had orchestrated the cover-up, stood before the crowd, and made a desperate proposal. They would hold a second funeral for Harold, a proper funeral to put his spirit to rest. They would acknowledge him as dead and beg his forgiveness for their treatment of him. But Harold had a different idea. On the morning of the planned second funeral, Harold appeared in the town square. But this wasn't the broken, mad Harold of recent months. This was something else entirely. Harold looked exactly as he had on the day he supposedly died, healthy, alert, completely normal. He was wearing the same clothes he had worn 6 months earlier. His face showed no signs of the mental breakdown he had suffered. It was as if the past 6 months had been erased. Harold walked to the center of the square and spoke in a clear, strong voice that carried to every corner of town. "I forgive you," he said, "but I have a condition." The crowd held its breath. "I will return to my grave," Harold continued, "but only when I am truly ready to die. Until then, you will maintain my burial site. You will bring fresh flowers daily. You will keep my memory alive, and when death finally comes for me, you will know. The flowers on my grave will wilt, and only then may you rest." With those words, Harold walked away. He returned to his house and resumed his normal life as if nothing had happened. The town, traumatized and desperate for normalcy, agreed to his terms, and so began the strangest arrangement in American history. For the next 12 years, Harold Wickham lived a double life. He was simultaneously alive and dead, walking among the living, while being memorialized in the cemetery. His grave received fresh flowers every day, brought by townspeople who treated the task as a sacred duty. His headstone was polished weekly. His burial plot became the most well-maintained grave in Vermont. Harold never spoke of the 6 months when the town treated him as dead. He returned to his job as telegraph operator. He paid his taxes. He lived quietly and bothered no one, exactly as he had before his supposed death. But the people of Millbrook were forever changed. They had learned what it meant to kill someone without actually killing them. They had discovered that death is more than just the stopping of a heart, it's the severing of all human connections. The erasure of a person from the community of the living. The town prospered during those 12 years. The conspiracy had been profitable, after all. Harold's seized assets had been quietly returned to him, but not before they had solved the municipal financial crisis. New businesses opened. Young families moved to Millbrook, attracted by the low crime rate and strong sense of community. But the older residents never forgot. They never stopped bringing flowers to Harold's grave. They never stopped watching for signs that their arrangement with the living dead man might be ending. Those signs came on November 7, 1950-9. Harold woke that morning feeling tired. It was nothing dramatic, just a persistent fatigue that made him want to stay in bed. But Harold knew. After 12 years of living, as both alive and dead, he had developed an intimate relationship with mortality. He walked to the cemetery that afternoon and stood beside his grave. The flowers were fresh, as they had been every day for over 4,000 days. Harold nodded his approval. "Tomorrow," he said to his headstone, "tomorrow I will join you." That night, Harold Wickham died. In his sleep, natural causes, his heart simply stopped beating at 3:27 in the morning. But the people of Millbrook didn't need to be told. At dawn, every person in town woke up with the certain knowledge that Harold Wickham was finally truly dead. They gathered at the cemetery and found exactly what Harold had promised them. The flowers on his grave had wilted overnight. Every single bloom was brown and withered, though they had been fresh and vibrant just hours before. Harold's second funeral was held that afternoon. This time, his body was actually in the coffin. This time, the grief was real. The town mourned. Not just Harold's death, but the loss of their strange guardian spirit, the man who had forgiven them for the unforgivable. As they lowered Harold's coffin into the ground, the same grave that had been waiting for him for 12 years, something extraordinary happened. The withered flowers on the grave began to bloom again. Fresh petals unfurled, colors returned, life reasserted itself. But these weren't ordinary flowers. These were flowers that had never been seen in Vermont before. Exotic blooms that shouldn't have been able to survive the climate. Flowers that glowed faintly in the darkness and gave off a sweet perfume that could be smelled from miles away. Harold's grave became a pilgrimage site. People traveled from across the country to see the impossible flowers that grew there. Botanists studied them and found species that didn't exist in any scientific classification. The flowers thrived year-round, unaffected by snow, drought, or season. But the most remarkable thing about Harold's final resting place wasn't the miraculous flowers. It was the effect they had on visitors. People who came to Harold's grave reported profound experiences of forgiveness. Estranged family members would reconcile after visiting together. Enemies would shake hands and make peace. Couples on the brink of divorce would rediscover their love. The flowers, it seemed, carried Harold's final gift to the world. The power to forgive and be forgiven. Millbrook never spoke publicly about what had happened. Official records still show that Harold Wickham died on March 22, 1947. His second death was never recorded. As far as the outside world knew, nothing unusual had ever occurred in their quiet Vermont town. But the people of Millbrook knew better. They knew they had participated in something that existed at the very edge of human understanding. They had learned that the line between life and death isn't as clear as we pretend it is. They had discovered that community has the power to kill or resurrect, to damn or redeem. The flowers still bloom on Harold's grave. 75 years later, they remain as vibrant and mysterious as the day they first appeared. The town of Millbrook continues to thrive, though most of the original residents have passed away. New generations have moved in, attracted by the town's reputation for peace and harmony. Few of them know the true story. They see only a beautiful cemetery with one especially lovely grave, tended with obvious care and devotion. They don't know they're looking at the final resting place of a man who died twice, who spent 12 years living as his own ghost, who forgave a town that had committed the perfect murder without spilling a single drop of blood. But sometimes, on quiet autumn evenings when the mist rises from the Connecticut River, longtime residents swear they can see a figure standing beside Harold's grave. A quiet man in a simple suit, nodding approvingly at the fresh flowers, checking to make sure his memory is being properly maintained. They say he looks peaceful now, content, no longer caught between life and death, but finally, truly, at rest. Harold Wickham's story is a reminder that the cruelest deaths aren't always physical. Sometimes, the most effective way to kill someone is to simply stop seeing them, stop acknowledging their existence, stop treating them as human. Haroldstown murdered him with indifference and brought him back to life with flowers. In the end, perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. We have the power to kill or resurrect each other every single day, simply by choosing whether to see the humanity in those around us. The next time you pass someone on the street, remember Harold Wickham. Remember that visibility is a form of love, and invisibility is a kind of death. Because sometimes, the line between the two is thinner than we think, and sometimes, just sometimes, the dead are more alive than the living.